Margaret. And thank you, Claire, for that great background on the Lake Simcoe protection aspects of this. So I've called this presentation, "Is this the best we can do?" for a reason. And I think it's because as I'll go through, we really have other options to address transportation needs in York Region and Simcoe County, but we just haven't fully explored them. And you'll see that the Bradford Bypass has followed a very strange process and continues to follow a very strange process. And that's one of the reasons why we don't have a lot of confidence in the reports that have been done so far and the claims about reports that will be done in the future. So just in terms of where the project is, for those of you who live in the area, it's a little bit north of Queensville Side Road, south of Holborn Road. It's just south of Cook Bay and Lake Simcoe. The idea of the Bradford Bypass is to connect the 400 and the 404 extension. It'll be just north of River Drive Park in Holland Landing, and it will be just south of 9th Line, just north of the built-up area in Bradford. The environmental assessment for the Bradford Bypass was completed in 1997, and I just want to let that land for a minute in terms of how long ago this environmental assessment was actually completed. When the environmental assessment was completed, I was 16 years old, and I grew up in that area. So that's how long ago there were public consultations about whether or not the Bradford Bypass should happen. And it predates, of course, the Greenbelt Plan, the Lake Simcoe Protection Plan, and the growth plan for the greater GTA. Now, important things to know about this assessment is that it did not consider any non-highway options to improve the road network. It considered different options, but it didn't look at non-highway road improvements. One of the most alarming things about this assessment is that it concluded that the stormwater runoff from the highway had the potential to severely, these are words right from the EA document, to severely impact the quality and quantity of surface and groundwater south of Lake Simcoe. And it also talks about how, because it goes through the Holland Marsh and it goes through areas that have very shallow sandy soils and a high groundwater table, that the whole system, not just the groundwater under the highway, but the groundwater system is susceptible to contamination and interference from the highway. There is no climate change assessment as part of the CA. There is no comprehensive assessment of the impact on fish habitat, migratory birds. There's no cumulative effects assessment of the combination of this highway and the 404 extension, or this highway and the sprawl that would go along with the highway. And there is no health impact assessment for noise, vibration, and air quality. There are some very serious natural environment impacts identified in this EA. The highway would have a 100-meter wide right-of-way, go through the Holland Marsh provincially significant wetland complex, and remove a large area of that wetland complex, including areas adjacent to fens and bogs, which are very unusual and difficult to replace. There is a large area of significant woodland. You can see here where the star is at the end of Bathurst Street. It's also an important birding area identified if you go on to eBird. It's a birding hotspot. And these river corridors, the east and west branch of the Holland River going into Cook Bay, are extremely important wildlife movement corridors that would be cut in half by the highway. There's also a number of listed endangered and threatened species that would be impacted, including this bird, the Louisiana water thrush. There's only 500 adults left, and one of the biggest threats to them is stormwater. So obviously this highway is a big concern for them. A number of other listed birds and reptiles are also impacted by the highway. The highway would remove an area that's described in the EA as high quality amphibian habitat. And you can see here just the sheer size and scale of the areas of environmentally significant areas in the Holland Marsh and wildlife habitat that would be impacted by the project. There's also a number of significant archaeological sites along the route, and there's some debate about the exact location of these sites, but one of them is the Lower Landing site, which is a very famous site, and a number of colonial archaeological sites are present, as well as what archaeologists refer to as Paleo-Indian sites, which means they're thousands and thousands of years old. We're talking like 7,000 and 10,000-year-old sites that would be destroyed by the highway. It goes through this pink area, or sorry, this purple area here, which is the Holland Marsh specialty crop area designated in the Greenbelt Plan, and you can also see the large areas here of protected countryside in the Greenbelt Plan that would be removed. There's a kind of a mythology around this project that everyone wants it, and there is no issue with it. But in fact, at the time when the EA was being done, it was highly controversial. There were local groups in Bradford and in East Gwillimbury who fought it. And it's important to remember that there haven't been public consultations on this project since the 1990s. And that doesn't mean that the issues have gone away or that the opposition has gone away. It just means that people aren't as informed about the project now as they were back then. One interesting thing about the 1997 EA was that one of the reasons it actually was finished was that they got rid of Environmental Assessment Board hearings where you could challenge the evidence in the EA before it was completed. Even with the removal of a public hearing requirement for the EA to get it done, it took 5 years for the EA to be approved because it had a number of important problems that it hadn't addressed, such as the archaeological sites, the stormwater and the groundwater issues, as well as a number of times MTO was the Ministry of Transportation, who was the proponent of the project, was asked to update their noise studies, and nobody was ever satisfied with them. So that was also made a condition of approval. Federal EA was required at that time, and it was until 2012 when federal environmental assessment legislation was changed, but they never went forward with the federal EA process. So what's happened since then? Well, the conditions of approval have not been fulfilled in the decades that have gone by since the EA was finished. They never did the stormwater and the groundwater study. They never did the stage 3 archaeological assessment. They never did the Class EA updates to update the transportation studies and the environmental studies. In the mid-2000s, the project was essentially canceled because the growth plan took the province in a different direction, more towards all-day two-way GO service and other solutions. In the meantime, we've had the Greenbelt Plan, the Lake Simcoe Protection Plan, and other protections put in place for wetlands and other agricultural lands and for Lake Simcoe. It seemed like this project was dead until in around 2016, the local municipalities lobbied very heavily and very suddenly to have it put back in a revision of the growth plan. And no clear justification was ever put in the growth plan for putting it back in. After 2012, of course, the federal EA requirement disappeared. So those detailed fish and migratory bird impact assessments never happened. And most recently, the Ontario government has proposed an exemption for the project from its 2002 approval conditions, as well as the Class EA requirement. Now, when you see politicians say that there's these 15 studies they're going to do, that's the Class EA requirement that they're proposing an exemption for. Now, that exemption hasn't passed yet, but what they've said is that they don't want to do those studies anymore. So there is no assurance at this time that those studies will ever be completed. The exemption talks about an exemption for early works. And it doesn't exactly explain what those are, but essentially it suggests that they would start building bridges across the east and west branches of the Holland River and other water courses without finishing any of the studies. Because it moves the conditions from an approval to an exemption, it's sort of a technical legal thing, but they're no longer really enforceable. There's no longer legally enforceable requirements for public and Indigenous consultation. And the government would also eliminate the appeal mechanisms that are in the Class EA process that way. They've eliminated some of them last year through Bill 197 for the public. And what's left is Indigenous appeal. That would also be eliminated by moving it to an exemption. No mention of how they would do the federal studies that are still outstanding to get proper permits to do those bridges. And just going back to this early works exemption, I mean, that's really the impetus for us requesting a federal EA. It's not bad enough that the 1997 EA was deficient in a number of significant ways, but they now don't even want to complete the studies they committed to completing under that EA approval. Really, the bottom line is, where is the current information? We're talking about studies that are 2 decades old, and it's one thing to update a few of the impact studies, but do we still need it? Some of the traffic studies are from the 1980s in that EA. They're before upgrades to Highway 9 and Green Lane. Like, Green Lane was a dirt road when I was 16 years old. It was not even the 4-lane road that it is now. We now have all-day two-way GO trains to Barrie, and one of the stated needs for the project really emphasized not traffic jams in Bradford or East Gwillimbury, which were not the significant driver at that time, but commuters from Barrie who needed to get to Toronto or York Region faster. And now we have all-day two-way GO trains that can facilitate some of that commuter traffic. We still need it after COVID, when many people are working from home? When does the public get to see the Ministry of Transportation's most recent regional traffic assessment, which I tried to FOI and was told I had to pay thousands of dollars to get back in 2016? Where are the regional master plans that explain why we need it? All of these things are missing. So what we would really like is an EA that can have as part of its process looking at other alternatives. How do we provide different access routes to the 400 so that people don't drive through downtown Bradford? Other solutions to some of the intersection problems at places like Green Lane and Yonge Street might be possible. A 4-lane controlled access highway is not the only solution. There are other solutions that need to be looked at. And more importantly, none of the studies that would be done under the Class EA, assuming that it goes ahead, and it may well not, would deal with things like cumulative effects, Indigenous rights, climate change, and Ministry of Transportation has always refused to do health impact studies of its highways. So we're never going to see that unless we get a federal EA. We know that highways are not a solution to traffic congestion if the primary concern is local traffic congestion. It's just a scientific fact that highways cause more congestion. They cause people to drive more kilometers. They cause bottlenecks on local roads at interchanges. And we've seen that if you live in the area, you have already seen that with the 404 extension, with congestion at Ravenshoe Road and places like that. Because it causes people to drive more, there are significant climate change impacts. And in Ontario, our transportation emissions are rapidly growing. We cannot meet our Paris targets if we keep building highways. It's just not possible. And I've included here a title of a paper. They actually call this phenomenon where highways cause people to drive more the fundamental law of road congestion. And I've heard a number of local politicians deny that this is actually a thing. To me, it's like denying that cigarette smoke causes cancer or denying that climate change is real. I mean, there's tons of evidence of this. In terms of cumulative effects, here are all the maps of all the people who own lots of pieces of land along the 404 and the 400 and the proposed Bradford Bypass route, who would stand to benefit from this highway. And the cumulative effect of both the highway and the salt on the highway and the increase in paved surfaces will increase phosphorus and chloride in Lake Simcoe and cause major impacts. I just want you to think about these maps here that show people living and working right next to these highways in large numbers when I show you these next slides on air quality. So these are images from Toronto Public Health showing the intense concentrations of nitrogen oxides along highways in Toronto and the very damning benzene figures for Highway 401. It's also particulate matter is a huge concern because you're putting all the cars in one place, you're concentrating the pollution all in one place, and you're causing a very, 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 very serious health impact issue. It's really no joke, and the evidence is increasing day by day of, it causes deficient lung development in children. It can cause Alzheimer's, heart disease. There was a huge drop in preterm births and low birth weight births during the COVID lockdown across the world because people were being exposed to less air pollution from cars. It's a major contributor to preterm births and low birth weights, lung disease, and it also can exacerbate COVID-19 outcomes. And we've also been to this movie before in the region with refusal of Ministry of Transportation to do proper noise studies with the 404 extension, an issue that I raised on behalf of a Smart Growth Ontario Smart Growth Network at that time. Our request for them to do better noise studies was denied, and sure enough, the highway opened and it was too loud and people were extremely upset. So if you live in this area, this is what you have to look forward to. Really the only solution is a federal EA. This province has recently gutted environmental assessment across the board. They clearly have no intention of properly assessing this highway. The Ministry of Transportation has a history of denying health impacts, regional air quality impacts, climate impacts, you name it. They don't believe in the fundamental scientific issues that are involved in building a highway. And the province has a history of not forcing them to do those studies properly. So what we've done is we've requested that the federal government designate it under the Federal Impact Assessment Act so that it can get a federal assessment which is overseen by an independent impact assessment agency. And the possible outcome is the Federal Minister of Environment can refuse to issue federal permits, which are required for the crossings on the rivers and any rail crossings or anything like that that the federal government has approval authority for, and they can require cumulative effects assessment and proper studies of the impacts on Lake Simcoe. And I get this question a lot. Yes, they do have authority, constitutional authority to review the impacts of highways. So it's really important that you support this request. The minister is going to make a decision by early April. You do need to, if you want to participate, comment. You can comment with the Impact Assessment Agency on their website directly about the Bradford Bypass. You can also sign Environmental Defense's petition, and I believe that Simcoe County Greenbelt Coalition is also sharing the link. Even if you are with an organization who has already supported our letter, I think it's really key that you get in touch with your local council and do some deputations, educate them about the risks of this project for Lake Simcoe, and also, individually call and write in with your members and supporters to support the federal EA. One of the biggest considerations for the federal government is public concern, and unfortunately, unlike GTA West, where there's been a lot of public consultations and people are generally more aware of what the impacts are, in the case of Bradford Bypass, those public consultations haven't happened yet, and so we're at a little bit of disadvantage in terms of people being aware of the problems. So please write to your MP, write to Minister Wilkinson, and educate your local council about why they should support our request, because they're all being asked by the impact agency what they think. York Region is going to make a decision this week, so please, if you live in York Region, please, please, please write to them and tell them that you want them to support this. And that's it.